is what they call an essential tremor. And an essential tremor is a benign tremor, except it's not harmless. I'm right-handed. And as far as we can tell, lead has impacted that.
How do you know your off-the-shelf soil that you're buying doesn't have accidental chemicals in it?
For decades, I ate a lot of chocolate, and I have a unusually high amount of lead in my body. Chocolate is full of lead. I had a third of an acre in Phoenix, Arizona, and I used to grow thousands of pounds of food on that property.
What's the cost associated with that in the first few years?
When I pick that peach, it drops in my hand, it's ready to eat, and take a bite of it, and the thing explodes a splash down the front of my shirt.
What can we do to better foster healthy soil?
The number one thing that we can do is...
For someone who is interested in starting an urban farm and they want that farm to provide the bulk of their household's
Or all of them.
or all of their household's produce.
When you say grow all of your food, are you talking about growing meats?
Let's just
I
say
guess so,
produce, fruits and vegetables for now.
Well, why not throw in a chicken in there as well?
Okay.
One of the things that people do that drives me nuts is they rake up leaves and throw them away. Those leaves have nutrients in them.
Can they still take a month-long vacation in Europe and ensure that their permaculture system will still be in shape when they come back?
That is a great question. Here's one of the big things, the big, huge, monstrous caveats that you have to pay attention to when you're starting a garden.
In today's episode, we're talking to Greg, a food growing expert who grew 80 fruit trees on just 0.3 acres of desert land.
We'll delve into what it takes to grow your own food and how it is possible no matter where you live.
Stick till the end to learn the top tips for first-time homesteaders and why all you need is a window to get started. Greg, what mission are you on?
So a lot of things happened for me in 1991, and one of them was I took a course at Landmark Education, and it was their advanced course, and they had me create a vision for my life. And the vision I created 33 years ago was that I'm the person on the planet responsible for transforming our global food system. And I've been on that mission really since I was born, but I solidified it when I was 30, and here we are 33 years later, and I'm still on that mission.
That is a very big mission you gave yourself.
Global food. What did you say? Global food. What?
I am the person on the planet responsible for transforming our global food system. We have a very broken food system. It's magical in that it feeds, 330 million people in the United States every day, 3 meals. So that's almost 1 billion meals a day. And the food's just not good for us. There's so many problems with our food delivery system and the food that actually ends up on our plate, and then the manufactured food that they call food, which isn't always great for us. So
How is it broken? Do you mind getting into it?
not at all. So one of the big things we talk about in my arena is called food miles. Are you familiar with food miles?
Well, I assume it has to do with how many miles your food has to travel before it gets to you.
Exactly. And how many miles is the average food traveling in the United States? That's the question. Got a guess?
I guess 500.
It's triple that. The average is 1,500 miles that it travels from where it is grown until it reaches your plate. The environmental impact of that is huge. So that is one big piece of it. The other big piece of it is that when it's harvested and it has to travel 1,500 miles, or in the case of a peach in January, that's coming from below the equator. So it's coming from Australia or it's coming from South America, and it's traveling many thousands more miles than that. So they're having to pick that food before it's ripe. And there is a physiological thing that happens in a plant when the food ripens on the tree or on the bush. And essentially what happens is the lectins, which is one of my coaches calls it an anti-nutrient, the lectins disappear out of something as it's ripening, and those lectins aren't good for us. And the longer it stays on the tree or plant, the more nutrient dense it becomes. So when they're harvesting these things, packaging them and shipping them thousands and thousands of miles, they're harvesting them not ripe, not completely nutrient dense, and with more lectins in them. And then what happens is, as soon as it's harvested, it starts degrading nutritionally. So you have a subnutrient fruit or vegetable that's being harvested, and once you harvest it and it starts traveling, it starts losing those nutrients. So the food that we're getting is less nutrient dense. And
Wait,
then,
Erica, did you know this?
Well, actually, I was going to ask, because I had heard that, say, an orange 80, 100 years ago had 5 times the amount of vitamins and minerals in it, or say like 5 times the amount of vitamin C in it than the oranges we get today, something like that. Is that true?
I don't have the facts around that, but I have what I've learned over the few decades that I've been doing this, almost 6 actually, is that the soils that we're growing food in these days, especially the industrial soils that we're growing food in these days, the soil is less nutrient dense. And so the trees and plants, in this case the citrus, has less nutrients to pull from to make the food more nutrient dense. So one of the things I talk about a lot in my education is, how do we grow healthy food? And we grow healthy food by growing healthy soil. The healthier the soil is, the less chemicals that are put on the soil, and the more we work on building the biological activity in that soil, the healthier the food is coming off of the plant. So that's the thought process behind your question.
I interrupted
So,
you.
you said the ripening process happens during the transportation, correct?
Exactly.
And how do they do that? Is that like an artificial environment they have to put the food in?
Sometimes I've heard they use ethylene. I don't know the facts around this, but I've read articles that say they use something called ethylene, I believe, that helps promote the ripening process.
It's interesting because we talked to someone who sells peaches, and she had told us you can tell that there's an issue with a lot of the peaches you get in the grocery store because they don't have a smell. When you go to a peach orchard, they have a very distinct, inviting smell, and you don't get that.
So I'm trying to understand. Sorry, go ahead.
Hold on. I have to jump in on that. I cannot eat a store-bought peach. I can't do it because I know that when I pick that peach and it drops in my hand, I'm getting chills all the way down my body right now. When I pick that peach, it drops in my hand, it's ready to eat, and I bend over and take a bite of it, and the thing explodes a splash down the front of my shirt. That's my experience of eating a peach. And the peaches that they sell in the grocery stores are so substandard from that. So, yeah, I can't eat store-bought peaches or apricots or plums for that matter.
Soil degradation. That's a big topic too. And I know in the US, we have this wonderful patrimony, I guess you would call it, of historically incredible soil quality, which I don't know how many people know this, but it's being degraded fairly rapidly.
Yes.
And so I know that this is a huge issue. The government is working to try and prevent it because obviously it could be a big problem for our ability to feed ourselves in the future.
Mm-hmm.
But what can we do to better foster healthy soil?
The number one thing that we can do to foster healthy soil is stop, all caps, using any kind of chemicals on your soil. Stop using any kind of chemicals, pesticides, any kind of herbicides, any chemical fertilizers. These are all uh, these all have a negative impact on soil. And I was at the urban farm, my house in Phoenix, Arizona. I lived there for 32 years. I was organic there for 32 years. I didn't use any herbicides, no pesticides, no chemical fertilizers. I didn't use any of that. And I had a third of an acre in Phoenix, Arizona that was 80 feet wide and 160 feet deep. It's not that big. And I used to grow thousands of pounds of food on that property every single year. And I did it by adding compost every year and organic fertilizers. And one of the things I talk a lot about in building a garden, if you're planting in straight dirt, dirt is broken down rock. There's not a lot of nutrient availability for the plants in straight dirt. So if you plant a fruit tree in dirt, if you plant your garden in just straight dirt, good luck. There's not a lot of oomph for your plants to grow. So what we do in our classes is we encourage people to make a 60-40 mix. So you get compost, you get planting mixes, you get some kind of nutrient dense soil that you, unless you're making it yourself, unless you're making compost yourself, really the thing to do is to add lots and lots of this organic matter in a 60-40 blend. That jump starts the process. There are 5 components of healthy soil. And if you have dirt, that's one of them. Dirt is broken down rock. There are 4 other components. They are airspace, water, organic matter, and everything that's alive in the soil. And the fix for broken dirt is to add lots and lots of organic matter, add compost, add planting mix, and mix it in. And I am a no-till farmer and gardener, which means I am not a fan of tilling your soil because there is a biological mix in layers in your soil. And when you till it, it messes with that biological mix. Except the first year. I am a proponent of the first year tilling your soil and adding lots and lots of organic matter. And by adding that organic matter, you're adding airspace, you're adding a space for water to get in, and with that organic matter comes soil life, the biology of the life. The biology of the soil. That's really what we're after, is to have biologically rich soil. And that's our goal as organic farmers and gardeners, is how do we make our soil biologically rich?
Right. We had Kathy on, right? And if I don't ask this question, she'll get mad at me.
Okay.
Do you ever use worms for composting?
Absolutely. So I had 4 different kinds of composting in Phoenix when I was there. I had chickens, I had traditional composting, I had worms, and I had soldier flies, black soldier fly composting that I was doing. When I got here, I didn't have the facilities set up. I've only been here 2 years, and I didn't have the facilities set up to be able to do most of that kind of composting. So I set up a worm bin from Urban Worm Company. It is a funnel shaped bin that sits on top of the ground, and you put worm food in the top. And as the worms do their process, they climb farther up to the top. And twice a year, I open the vent at the bottom and I knock out the worm castings. And worm castings are some of the most biologically active. Remember, I said that was a really good thing. They're the most biologically active and they're nutrient dense, so that you can add lots and lots of nutrients to your soil by using worm castings. And
Right. You also mentioned, so you mentioned third of an acre where you had how many plants or trees?
so what I had in Phoenix, I lived there in that particular property for 32 years. I had what we call in permaculture an old growth food forest. And that basically means is that I had systems set up so that they would automatically make food. My entire job on that property was pruning fruit trees and harvesting food. And on that property, I had dozens of things that would come back year after year. I had basil and nasturtiums and parsley and kale and lettuce that would replant themselves every year because I would let things go to seed. And on that property, I had 80, yes, 80 fruit trees that all made fruit. I had fruit that I would harvest from November to July, different varieties of citrus and peaches and apples and loquats and plums and apricots, all kinds of cool things that I would eat.
0.3 acres, and you had a house there as well?
Yep, there was a 2,200 square foot house on the property.
So it's pretty much covered with trees. Right?
Well, one would think that was the case, but it wasn't. I had about 40 fruit trees in the front yard. And what I did in permaculture, are you familiar with that term?
Oh, yeah, please explain. Yeah.
Permaculture, I like to call the art and science of working with nature. So, what we do in permaculture when we're studying it and implementing it is we look at natural systems and we put them in place. So, when you go into a forest, there's nobody tending the forest, but there's all kinds of food to eat. That's basically what I did with my property in Phoenix. I mimicked nature for the 32 years that I was there, and I let nature do what it does naturally.
I
And
see.
one of the things for 40 fruit trees in my front yard at the urban farm was that I put them in hedgerows. So along the front of the property, it was 60 feet from the driveway to my north property boundary. And I put 16 citrus trees from my driveway to the north property boundary. And it made a really, really nice 10-foot tall, 4-foot deep or 4-foot wide hedge of citrus that made fruit for me in November, December, January, February, March, and April. So, and then down the north side of the property, I had another citrus or another citrus and deciduous tree hedge. And then on the south side of the property, I had an apple hedge with 10 apple trees in it. And so really what we're doing in permaculture and in especially for urban areas, we're going dense with fruit tree production. And
Right.
one of the big things that does for us is that I'll plant 3 different varieties of peach trees, and I'll keep the trees 8 feet, 10 feet tall max, and they ripen at 3 different times. We call this successive ripening. So in mid-May, I was getting the desert gold peach with, if you've ever had a tree-picked desert gold peach, it'll tingle your toes when you eat it. It is absolutely amazing. 2 weeks later, I was harvesting tropic snow peaches, which is a white flesh peach. And 2 weeks later, I was harvesting a mid-pride peach. So that's how I got the density that I got on that property. Because when it would always freak people out when I would do tours in the front yard at the urban farm. I would say, all right, there's 37 fruit trees in the front yard. And people would look around and say, whoa, where? And then we would do a count because the middle of the front yard was open. It was an open space for us to hang out in.
Right. So I'm still trying to understand the concept of permaculture, and you
Okay.
tell me if I understood this correctly. So essentially, you want to set up the farm, let's call it farm, in such a way where all of the plants and trees are native to that environment, right? So you don't actually have to do anything additional. The natural environment will take care of it. Is that correct?
Not quite. You almost had it. The native part is where we go a different direction. The fruit trees and the plants that I planted at the urban farm in Phoenix, Arizona were not native. I had a few natives, but what I was doing is I was looking to see what would it take to have a food forest in place. And what I did over the course of that 32 years is I grew really, really, really healthy soil. And with that healthy soil, it makes it really easy to grow things that aren't from your area.
I see. So Erica, weren't you remember I asked you this question before and you said you only want to use the native plants because some of them are like aggressive species that take over the native ones?
Yeah, well, I mean, it depends on what lens you're looking through. In sort of
Why don't you
conservation,
yeah,
you want to
present that
prioritize
argument to him?
native species. Also, in the Southwest, and in other areas where water is an issue, you want to make sure that you're growing plants that are drought tolerant. So native plants are good for that.
Yes.
But yeah, from a conservation standpoint, there's the goal of trying to bring back native species and remove invasive species. And there's also the concern of when you introduce a non-native species, is it going to take over and start growing rapidly and out competing the native species?
Right.
Yeah, yes to all of that. And growing strictly natives in the desert, while there is a lot to eat in the desert, it makes it a little more challenging to grow a food forest in your yard. And I get this question a lot because it does take more water to grow fruit trees, and it does take more water to
Yeah,
grow vegetables.
that was going to be my question. What was the water consumption in
Well,
your
I
plan?
I had an interesting property in Phoenix. It was on something called flood irrigation. And it's a water right that comes with properties that used to be agricultural properties. And there are something like 30,000 acres of flood irrigated properties in the Phoenix metropolitan area. And that basically means that once a month in the winter and twice a month in the summer, you get 6 inches of a lake in your front and backyard. Now, is that the wisest thing to do with water in the desert? Probably not. However, one of the things that it does is that kind of water greens up areas, so it keeps the city cooler. It also helps replenish the water table. And this is water that runs across the valley anyways, because they're harvesting it from the rim up north of Phoenix and running it through. So that's the kind of property that I had. So I had a fair amount of water. The problem with flood irrigation in Phoenix is most people grow grass. And growing grass in the desert is ludicrous. So I set up this property 30 years ago to showcase how you could create a food forest that could feed your family in your neighborhood on this floodwater. Now, I also know people that have created food forests in the desert without flood irrigation. It's a water management practice. And, I used to get a little bit of heat, especially from our friends down in Tucson, about why are you growing fruit trees in the desert? Well, there's the environmental impact. Remember food miles?
Right.
Of shipping apples and peaches and apricots and food all those miles. So there's the environmental impact of shipping them, or there's the environmental impact of using water to grow your garden. And back to your question about cost of water. So my flood irrigation used to cost me $120 a year. And then in the summer, my city water bill, because I was using city water to water the gardens, in the summertime would be up $80 to $100. And I was harvesting a lot of food to offset that. So it's water use in the desert Southwest is an interesting conversation, and it needs to be done a lot more consciously than people are doing it there.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very complicated topic. I know we could go down a rabbit hole on it. I could see the argument, though, that potentially it would be a better use if people are going to live in the desert, which obviously they do. It would be a better use of water for people to grow their own food rather than have a bulk of it go to large-scale farms that are primarily producing livestock feed.
Yes, exactly.
So I wanted to ask you, if someone wants to replicate what you did, say in Michigan, obviously they'll still have to deal with the local climate or local weather challenges, right?
Yes, yes.
So how do they use the same mindset but also be successful in growing fruit trees in their houses?
So are we talking edible landscape or fruit trees or both?
Or both, yeah.
Yeah, okay. First thing I would suggest that people do, we yearly, usually in November, December, January, we give free online Zoom webinars on introduction to permaculture. So you can check those out. I would also suggest you Google your town name, whatever city or town you're in, and the word permaculture. It's permaculture. It's a combination of permanent and agriculture, or permanent and culture. So it's PERMACULTURE. Just Google that and the name of your city that you live closest to and see what comes up, because it is very likely that there are permaculture practitioners which will help you design a landscape. But much better than that, if you're interested, I would highly suggest that you do what is called a PDC, a permaculture design course. And a permaculture design course is a 72-hour introduction to permaculture. And there's usually a lot of hands-on with it. And it really does a deep dive into how to implement permaculture practices in your life. Now, permaculture isn't just about gardening. Permaculture, for me, has expanded into my entire life. There's a concept in permaculture called stacking functions. And stacking functions basically means you're using one asset to do multiple things for you. And in permaculture, we like to call a chicken in our landscape a permaculture chicken. And in our landscape, a chicken gives us eggs. It gives us poop, which is nutrients for our plants. They dig, they eat bugs, they eat weeds, so that you have this one asset doing multiple things for you. Same thing with a fruit tree. If you plant a fruit tree in your landscape with the concept of permaculture behind it, you're using those leaves that fall off of the plant. Those leaves contain nutrients that people are raking up and throwing away wherever away is. But what we want to do in permaculture is we want to use that fruit tree mulch, leaves to make mulch. So that fruit tree gives us mulch. It gives us shade. It gives us fruit. And so we have one asset that we are doing multiple things with. So all that to answer your question, learn permaculture. Whether it's taking one of our online classes or attending something live, but do a little bit of a dive to the P word in your neighborhood and see who's teaching it and what they're teaching. There are literally tens of thousands of permaculture practitioners around the world, probably hundreds of thousands, that have taken permaculture design courses and now teach pieces of it or teach it, the whole thing.
And the reason you're saying it's you look up your location and then look up the word permaculture is because every location will have different solutions, correct?
Exactly. So the permaculture design course that I still give through my company, Urban Farm, we still do a permaculture design course every spring in Phoenix, is a drylands permaculture course. Because in the desert, it's dry. In Michigan, it's going to be probably a wetlands permaculture design course. So it depends. So with permaculture, the design course, there is a basic structure, and then it is tailored to where you live.
I see.
So I would not suggest somebody in Michigan going to Phoenix to take a permaculture design course.
Right.
Find one near your house.
Right. And how much workload is it for the person or a household setting up this system? Like, can they still take like a month-long vacation in Europe and ensure that their permaculture system will still be in shape when they come back?
That is a great question. And yes, because if you look at a forest and you go away for a month and then come back, how's it doing? Right? Now, there are certain systems that you would have to set up to make sure that things are going to be managed well. When we would go on vacation, we had chickens, cats, and dogs at the urban farm in Phoenix. So when we went on vacation, we had to have somebody stay at the house to manage our chickens, cats, and dogs. And so you have to take that into consideration. Watering, especially in the desert. So where I am in Nashville, we can go away for a month and things will get watered. In fact, the funny thing is, when I arrived here 2 years ago, I went to the hardware stores, multiple hardware stores, looking for drip irrigation supplies. They don't sell them here. You can't get drip irrigation supplies in Asheville, North Carolina. I had to order it online. And in Phoenix, if you walk away from your garden for 3 days in the summertime, it's going to be dead. So you have to set up systems to auto water your gardens while you're gone. So there are certain things that, depending on your climate, that you have to automate a little bit. But part of the permaculture process is that you put things in place so that eventually all you have to do is harvest food. Because that's how nature works.
Yeah. No, I'm trying to understand, why did you even need the drip water system in North Carolina? Isn't it like super humid there?
Yes, good question. I am an elderberry farmer now. I had a conversation with a local purveyor of elderberry products here in Asheville on my podcast in December of 2022. And I said to her, where do you get your elderberries? And she said, well, I get a few of them here and a few of them there, but most of them come out of Europe. And it was like, hold on, what did you just say? Most of her elderberries are coming out of Europe. And I did a little bit of research and I found that most elderberries come from Europe in the United States because we don't have a lot of growers here. So I jumped in January of 23 and started 100 elderberry plants, and we planted them in July of 23. Now, our dry season, and I'm getting to your question, I promise, our dry season here is July, August, September. And usually in July, August, and September, we get a half inch of rain or so a month. For unestablished elderberries and the rest of my trees, I actually planted 160 fruit trees and berry bushes, including the elderberries, last June. That's not going to have them survive, especially their first and second year. Once they get established, it's likely that I won't need to water them extra. But when I planted my elderberry orchard, I also planted a watering system so that they would get watered. Yeah, there you go. That's why.
Right.
So for someone who is interested in starting an urban farm and they want that farm to provide the bulk of their household's
Or all of them.
or all of their household's produce,
Mm-hmm.
how much work and what's the cost associated with that in the first few years?
And also, like, how big the property needs to be. Can they do it in like a quarter acre property?
So, yes, there is a concept out there called square foot gardening. and I think it was Mel Bartholomew that created it. And he claims, he's no longer with us, but when he was alive, he claimed that 1,000 square feet, in 1,000 square feet of growing space, you can grow enough food for your family.
That's it.
That's it. And here's the thing, though. When you say grow all of your food, are you talking about growing meats?
Let's just
I
say
guess so, yeah.
produce, fruits and
Produce?
vegetables for now.
Okay,
Well,
good.
why not throw in a chicken in there as well?
Okay.
Well, and I actually did in the mid-aughts. I raised broiler chickens and raised them from chick to plate. I did that whole process. I'm not a vegetarian. I eat poultry, and so I figured if I was going to be in this part of the conversation, I need to at least know what it would take to get a chicken on my plate. And going through that process, I learned what it takes, and I butchered chickens, and I don't have to do that again. And now I appreciate paying $25 for an organic chicken. And so taking the meat out of the plan, the next thing we have to talk about is wheat, because a lot of our diet is wheat. So are you going to grow your own wheat? Yes, you can. And my friend Bill McDorman grows all of his own wheat in about 1,000 square feet. So that's a possibility. And the big thing, going back to your question of costs involved, the big thing is to get your soil in a place where it's going to grow healthy, nutrient-dense food. And that's the big cost. I'm looking out the window right here, and I just spent $500 for 3 cubic yards of healthy planting soil for my garden. Now, the raised bed that I'm going to put it in cost me $30. So where I spend my money is in my soil. Now, I only have to do that once, because what I'm going to do going forward in the future is I'm just going to add worm castings that I make myself and compost that I make myself on top. And what I did at the urban farm for 32 years is I would go in every year or two and I would add a couple of inches of nice organic compost on the top. And I would do that year after year after year. And what I found was that after doing that for, this would have been about 5 or 6 years ago, for 25 years, I had 2 feet of topsoil that was good for growing food in. And that came from me just adding organic matter year after year after year. So the big cost of your startup for your gardens needs to be your soil. And you get
Can
what
you
you pay
do
for.
Can you do a healthy soil from scratch, or do you have to buy the first iteration from outside?
You can absolutely do a healthy soil from scratch. It just takes a lot more time. And it
How much
makes
time are we talking?
3 to 5 years.
Oh wow! So you better be spending, like, it's better to spend $500 than wait three years. Is what you're saying,
That jump starts my garden.
right? But theoretically, if someone doesn't have time to do composting, they could theoretically keep on buying and replacing if they
Yeah,
have the money but not the time.
yeah. And compost isn't that expensive. One cubic yard of compost delivered to your house is, it's probably $200 here where I'm at. And, you just need a half or 3/4 of an inch on top every year. Once you get started, just add a layer on top every year.
It's the topsoil that matters the most.
It is. It absolutely is. And one of the things that people do that drives me nuts, I mentioned this earlier, is they rake up leaves and throw them away. Those leaves have nutrients in them. One of the best kind of composts on the planet is leaf mold compost. And you get leaf mold compost by raking up those leaves and putting them in a pile and letting them break down over the next 6 months and then putting it in your garden. It's that simple. That's exactly what happens in the forest. Nobody comes along in the forest and puts down compost. Nature puts down compost, and a deer comes by and poops, and an animal dies and breaks down, and branches fall and break down. Basically, what we're doing in permaculture is we're replicating all of that.
How do you measure? Do you use any tools to measure, say, the humidity or the pH levels or whatever indicators you can to confirm that it is indeed healthy?
So you can have a soil test done, absolutely. And my cooperative extension here in Buncombe County in North Carolina does free soil tests. So you check with your cooperative extension. Basically, what that's going to tell you is what your soil has an abundance of and what it's missing nutrient wise. But here's the thing. If you're just say you want to just make a leaf mold compost. If you just start adding that to your garden over the course of the next 2 to 5 years, your soil's going to self-balance. It's going to be good. And you don't have to add a lot of those other things. If you want to take the time and
Right.
wait.
But
My thing is
but
I'm 63 years old and I don't want to wait.
but going back to my question, do you have any tools on hand to measure like humidity and other stuff?
So I'm looking out at I have a little greenhouse right out here, and I have um, a weather station on top of that. So I have my weather station, and it measures humidity outside. It doesn't measure humidity in the soil, but it measures humidity outside. It measures rain. We're getting rain today, so it'll when I go look at the display board, it'll tell me how much rain we've gotten. The wind thing is spinning because it's windy outside. Um, I do have a pH test kit for soil. I'm trying to think, but I think I have one of those. I don't use it a lot because really all there is for me to do is add healthy soil on top. And now for my blueberries, I have to make sure that we acidify them, the soil underneath. So I'll be probably adding some uh, agricultural grade sulfur to acidify the soil a little bit because they need more acidic soil, as do azaleas. So, but the tools I don't use. I mean, I have my shovels, and one of the things that I can do is, stick a shovel down and, see what the soil looks like down there. But I don't have any um, modern day tools for measuring any of that. I've been doing
Okay.
it long enough. I planted my first garden in 1975, and back then it was second nature to me. Right now it's second nature to me. I just, I look at, so I can tell soil. Here's one of the big things, the big, huge, monstrous caveats that you have to pay attention to when you're starting a garden. If you are using cow manure or horse manure, you have to know what the farmer is feeding those animals, because if they're feeding them grains and grasses that have been sprayed with chemicals like chemical herbicides or any chemicals whatsoever, or they're giving them deworming chemicals, they're pooping that stuff out. You're going to bring that manure home, put it in your garden, and there is a high likelihood that your plants will die because of the chemicals that are in the manures that you use. So you have to be really conscious of where those manures are coming from and what they're being fed.
Right. A soil test would catch that though, right?
Not really. Now you can have a soil test done, but here's the problem with soil tests. What are you testing for? Because each one of the chemicals out there that are used in herbicides and pesticides and that kind of stuff have to be tested separately. So you have to know a list, and it could be a list of hundreds of things that you would have to test for. A general soil test is going to test for nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, some micronutrients, those kinds of things. So the soil tests test for the nutrient density of the soil. They don't test for chemicals.
So how do you know your off the shelf soil that you're buying doesn't have accidental chemicals in it?
You don't. So,
Yeah, I'd heard that this
Let
was
him
going to be
complete.
one of my
Let him
questions though,
complete.
because I'd heard that
No, let him
topsoils were
complete.
not well
Let him complete.
regulated. You know,
right, exactly. So, what I've done in Phoenix is we have a company that we work with called Tanks Green Stuff. They're out of Tucson, and we get all of our bagged and bulk soil from them, and they test for everything they can test for. It is highly tested compost and soils. And I found one here in Asheville called Dirt Craft, and they do the same thing. So the big companies can test for all of this. There was one company here in Asheville, I won't mention their name, but they got stuck with a bunch of horse manure with chemicals in it, and it was killing people's plants when they put it in their gardens. And this was a company that should have known better. And they had to learn the lesson the hard way. And as far as I can tell, they've corrected the issue now. But so the bigger companies, and I'm not talking multinational companies, but the soil companies like Dirtcraft, they're a small locally owned company. Tanks Green Stuff in Tucson is a small locally owned company, but they're on top of that. They're making sure that the bagged and soils that you're getting from them are as free of this stuff as can be possible. Here's the problem. We live in a very polluted world, and we can't go anywhere on the planet where there's not pollution. So at this point in life, in 2024, what we're doing is we're doing the best that we can do. And what I give you is caveats, like with horse and cow manure, make sure you know what they're getting fed, or don't use it. I just don't use that kind of manure on the property here.
so yeah. Speaking of contamination, that raises another question, especially in urban farming, of contaminated soils, particularly with heavy metal.
Mm-hmm.
And in those instances, you just have to, use a bed, right? Not use any of the soil from your property. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah. Do raised beds in that case. So one of the things that from the 50s, 60s, and 70s was lead paint. And so one of the things that we suggest is that if you have an older home that was painted, that you have the soil around your house tested for lead. And that's simple to do. You just take soil samples and find a soil testing or a chemical testing company in your area. They're all over the place, and they can test it for you.
So how does the raised beds work? Like, don't the roots still have to go down further?
They do. They do to a certain extent, and it's we do the best we can do. And
Right.
raised beds, when we're going raised beds, I usually go a foot to 2 feet. In fact, I'm looking at one raised bed that's almost 3 feet out of my window here. And so I'm going to put the really good soil into that. And when the roots get all the way down to the bottom, yeah, they might go into the dirt below. And we live in a really polluted world. We can just do the best that we can do.
But once they have at least some healthy roots, by the time they reach the contaminated portion, the hope is that they'll be able to survive. Is that
Yes.
correct?
Yeah. Well, and it's
Although-
not just survive. Some of the time, these plants are uptaking these nutrients,
Yeah,
these chemicals, these herbicides, these pesticides, the lead, and especially lead. Lead is a big problem in our culture right now. And I'm going to tell your listeners something they may not want to hear, but chocolate is full of lead. And there are some they just did a big study recently. I'm trying to remember the name of the organization that did it, and they found toxic level of lead in some chocolate products.
Yeah. Also, I know there's a big thing about baby food too.
Yep,
lead.
exactly. Well, and here's one thing. You don't see this because I hide my hand. That is what they call an essential tremor. And an essential tremor is a benign tremor. So it's harmless, except it's not harmless. I'm right-handed. This is my right hand that's shaking. And as far as we can tell, lead has impacted that. Lead has had that be is probably one of the causative factors of an essential tremor.
Yeah, I mean, lead poisoning is still a major issue in the country,
Yep.
even though it's gotten better. But I know,
Yeah.
there's
And
only.
Go ahead.
Oh no, go on.
I eat a really clean diet. I eat a really clean diet. For decades, I've eaten a really clean diet. And for decades, I ate a lot of chocolate. And I have a unusually high amount of lead in my body. And we've been, for 3-4 years, I've been detoxing, and it still is there. So pay attention to lead.
So just to wrap up this question of starting your own backyard farm,
Mm-hmm.
how much, so I guess we've asked this, but how much work really is it? Is it something that you can do on your Saturdays, or is
Like
it
part-time.
something where you really need to be invested in making it part of your
Yeah.
day-to-day life?
Or in other words, can you do it part-time, or you have to do it full-time for a fully sustainable food source?
So it depends. And it depends on how long you want it to take and how deep you want to dive in. The thing about my third of an acre in North Phoenix is that I probably put 5 hours a week into the property.
Yeah.
And that was mostly feeding the chickens, harvesting food, doing a little bit of tree trimming, that maybe 8 hours a week. But that was when it was already set up. And I took 20 years to set it up. I tell people often, spend at least a year on a property before you make any major changes, because you're going to see things that you're not going to, after a year, that you see differently after a year. And so what I suggest that people do is start with one project or 2 projects and get that done. Discover, maybe the first thing you want to do is discover where you want to put your first garden at. This is a really important piece, and it takes observation. If you, in the northern hemisphere, if you put your garden on the north side of a structure, it's not going to get enough sun. You need to put it on a east side or a south side of a structure in order for it to get enough sun. And you'll come to understand that by spending time and seeing where this, what parts of your property get sun. So, maybe your first step is to put in a couple of gardens. And
Right.
what I always suggest people to do is start slow and do a little bit at a time and get some successes. Because here's the thing, if you do 2 or 3 or 4 or 10 things and you fail at them, because you are going to fail at things. I grew gardens in Phoenix for 46 years before I moved here. I don't know. In Phoenix, I did not know what a first garden was, because my first garden happened in the 1970s. And I was just successful at growing gardens because I'd been doing it for 4 decades. And I moved here. And my first garden here bit the dust. It was a miserable failure. And I had a friend of mine remind me, "Oh, Greg, don't forget your first garden is your worst garden." Well, how would I remember that? Because I hadn't had a first garden for 40 years. So you're going to have failures. It's part of the learning process. There's nothing wrong with it. So start slow, make small incremental steps, take a permaculture design course or a permaculture introduction course, and start to understand how nature works in your yard. I wrote this.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, please go ahead.
I was going to say, like, are there any services available where you can hire a permaculture expert and like someone like you, and we'll like, well, we're buying this 2-acre property in Phoenix. We would like to set up a garden fully sustainable, but obviously we don't want to spend 20 years building it. We'll just hire you and you build it for us in a year. Is that even possible?
Yes, they're called permaculture designers. and they are available. And so again, what I would do is put the name of your city and permaculture designer in a search on one of the search engines and see what comes up. And I would definitely highly recommend that you check their ratings on Google or any of the other services out there to make sure that they get, 3, 4, 5 stars.
Right. But the second part of the question, is it possible to set up that level of successful garden/farm in the first year itself, as long as you are being guided by a professional?
You're going to have more success that way, but I would say realistically, it's going to take 3 to 5 years to
At the
get
minimum.
at the minimum to get something up that we would call successful,
Okay.
because we're dealing with nature.
Regulations. How many cities will allow a full-scale food farm within their boundaries, especially if you want to incorporate things like chickens?
Mm-hmm. So that remember I said my degrees are in urban planning? That was on purpose, by the way. And you have to check with your municipality about chickens. One of the things that I did in the front yard of the urban farm in Phoenix, so a majority of our food forest in Phoenix at the urban farm was in the front yard. So over the years, I had the mayor of Phoenix come and see my front yard. I had the neighborhood services. At one point, I did a tour for neighborhood services for them to come out and see what I was doing edible landscape wise in the front yard. You have to check with your city municipality to see what the legislation is around that. And if you're just landscaping your yard and it just looks like a landscaped yard, oh, but by the way, everything's edible or supports edible, there's no problem with that. Because, it looks like a nicely landscaped yard.
All right. So here's a question. Say I live in Alaska. I don't get a lot of sun, or maybe they do. I'm assuming they don't get a lot of sun.
Well, it depends the time of year. And in July, they get 23 hours of sun.
Right. So yeah, they don't get a lot of sun year long. Is it possible to set up an indoor permaculture facility, like with like artificial lights and stuff, or is that too ambitious of a project?
Well, definitely not too ambitious, and definitely can set up, a indoor food farm, but I wouldn't call it permaculture. Permaculture takes natural systems and has those natural systems manage your space. If you're doing something inside in a warehouse, in a basement, that's all human generated stuff, which I highly suggest you experiment with that and play with it. There are people out there growing mushrooms and microgreens and lettuce. In fact, one of my favorite toys for growing food is called a tower garden. It is a 6-foot tall tower that, when it's fully growing food in it, looks like a Christmas tree. So it's that shape of a Christmas tree, and it's all food growing. It's put out by a company called Juice Plus. And in Phoenix, we used to plant our tower garden out in March with lettuce and greens and stuff to make salad out of, and grew them inside under lights for May, June, July, August, and September, because you can't grow greens in the desert that time of year because it's too hot. So it is absolutely possible to grow food indoors. I just wouldn't call it permaculture.
Right. But the soil, how would the soil system work? It'll just be like above ground, right?
The tower garden is hydroponic. So there's no soil involved at all. It's just water.
Right. But then you're limited to the hydroponics based food, right? because that's only certain foods you can grow from that in that category. Is that correct?
Ish. Yeah, ish. That's yes. It's
Okay.
hard to grow carrots in hydroponics or beets. Root crops are not too great to grow in hydroponics, although I'm sure it's being done somewhere. Um,
Right.
but you can grow a
Sure.
lot, and you can grow a lot hydroponically.
I'm sure artificial intelligence will help us get to the next level.
Right?
All right, Erica, I know we're getting over
So,
time.
yeah, as we're coming up on time, I wanted to get back to your mission. So, you want to be the person who changes our entire food system.
Yes.
How successful do you think you've been at that so far?
Extremely. So, and here's the thing. I can't do it alone. This isn't a Greg task. What I do is I speak about it on podcasts like this, on my own podcast. My podcast, the Urban Farm Podcast, has over 800 episodes, started in 2015, over 5 million listens at this point. Um, Getting the word out is a big piece of what I do, and getting people inspired. In probably 2007 or so, I started a conversation called 10,000 Urban Farms in Phoenix. And I would bet if we went back and counted in Phoenix, there's at least 5,000 urban farms in Phoenix. People, they latched on to that, and they're growing food in their front and backyard. And here's the thing: to be an urban farmer, to be a farmer, it's a shift in how we think. You shift from gardening as a hobby, farming is a profession. So when we're farming, we're consciously growing food. And gardeners have done this for decades. I'm just proposing that you can think about it differently. So what I suggest is that people grow food, share it. And if you're sharing food with your neighbors, with your family, at the farmer's market, um, then you can call yourself a farmer. I bless you, you can do that. And then what I suggest that you do is you name your farm, because naming your farm gives it an identity of its own. And so you're having a conversation with somebody, and oh, what's your hobbies, or what do you do? Oh, I run Jack's Beanstalk in Phoenix. That's the name of one of the farms in Phoenix. And people giggle a little bit. It engages them in a conversation, a local food conversation, because that's really the solution to our global food problems: is growing food in our cities, in our towns, in our neighborhoods, in our front yards, in our backyards. When I was in Croatia in 2014, I was there for 3 weeks on a food systems trip with Arizona State University. Most everybody had food growing in their front yard. I would walk down streets, and this person had a garden, and this person had a garden, and this person had a garden. People get it in Europe. I saw the same thing in Italy in 2004. We need to shift that in our country now. Grow something. Start a small garden. Yeah, just jump in.
So, is it safe to say then that you think the primary solution to our broken food system is to have people start to grow their own food again? Or is there
You said it.
is
There it is.
is there also a way that our traditional large agricultural producers can participate in the shift as well?
I'm sure there is, and I don't hold any malice against our traditional food producers. They are feeding 330 million people a day. That is in itself a miracle. I just think that downsizing it to a more local food economy is a much better solution. And I'm hoping that as we move forward, some of the larger players in the food system decide to go local. And, we're seeing a lot of this in all of our cities. People are starting to grow food a lot more. Are you guys in New York City?
Yeah.
Yeah, go to the local farmers markets. I've been to New York City before, and one of the things, not surprisingly, when I was in New York City, I visited the farmers markets. There's some amazing farmers markets in New York City, and they're growing food in New York City and outside of New York City and bringing it in, having it available for sale. Support your local farmer.
Is it even possible for the larger corporations that are feeding billions of people daily or millions? Is it even possible for them to stop using chemicals altogether?
Well, I guess it depends who you ask. I say yes. It's a shift in how we do the system. The problem is that there is so much money in chemicals that it would significantly negatively impact the bottom line of companies like Bayer and Monsanto and these companies that are selling these products. And so that, I think it's more of a uh, capital issue than it is a farming issue.
I mean, I know, well, there are big organic farmers, and organic may not be perfect, but they definitely use less in the way of chemicals.
Oh yeah.
I mean, there are regulations around it, but counter argument there is organic is, of course, more expensive. So
Right.
people would say, conventional produce is already very expensive for a large chunk of the population.
We'll have governments subsidize it.
Yes.
But I suppose your answer there is people should grow their own food.
Exactly. So there was a TED Talk a couple decades ago where a young kid, 14-year-old, was speaking about this topic. And he said, well, you can pay for it now in more expensive food, or you can pay for it later in the hospital bills and medical bills. So, and it's you're right. It's choices we have to make. In 2001 or 2002, I was watching the Today Show, and they were talking about, and they had this family. They had, I can't remember if it was 3 or 4 generations of people living in this 1,000-square-foot house. And they showed the house, and they showed around the house, and they talked to the family members on how they were struggling. This was 20 years ago. And all I could think of was all that land around that house where they could be growing their own food. Seeds are inexpensive. You can start a garden without doing healthy soil right away, but you just have to start.
What about apartment dwellers, though?
So I wrote a little book. I don't have it here right now. It's called Grow Wherever You Go. And it was exactly about that. It was about, all right, if you have a balcony on an apartment, what can you grow? Well, there's bucket gardens, 5-gallon bucket gardens. There's tower gardens. Here's the thing. I've told people this for years. The most expensive thing to buy in the grocery store and the easiest thing to grow do you have an idea of what that is? Say herbs.
Oh, herbs.
Herbs.
Yes.
Herbs, for $5, you get 4 branches of basil. You can grow herbs in a sunny windowsill. It can be that simple. I interviewed a guy on my podcast, my gosh, probably 5 or 6 years ago, and he used to grow salads in jars by growing sprouts. He sprouted seeds, and he wrote a whole book on how to grow a salad in jars by sprouting seeds. On a positive note, it is super simple to grow your own food. And when you grow your own food, it is more nutrient dense, it is healthier for you, and I'll tell you what, there were multiple times at the Urban Farm in Phoenix when I would harvest an entire meal minus the oil to cook the vegetables out of my yard. And there is nothing more gratifying than that.
Well, that's certainly a very positive note to end on here. And so for anyone who's inspired and now wants to go out and get started, how can they get in contact with you, learn from you, find more resources?
So there is my podcast at urbanfarmpodcast.com, and it's on all the major players out there. Here's what I would suggest. If you want to learn how to grow healthy soil, I have a series of classes and videos that I give called Healthy Soil Hacked. Go to healthysoilhacked.com and you can sign up for it. It'll put you on our email list, and you'll get my mini book called, here it is right here, my mini book called My Ordinary Extraordinary Yard as a PDF, and you'll learn how I created the urban farm over the course of about 25 years. So that's healthysoilhacked.com.
All right.
Thank you so much.
You bet.
Thank you.
It's been a blast. Thank you so much for having me.